So, hi all to our fifth session of Qualifie, our fifth and final session of this term. Welcome everybody. And this session today will concentrate on post-colonialism as an epistemology and how post-colonialism as such as a theory of epistemology connects to practices of knowledge, to doing research, producing knowledge, etc. We're super excited to be joined by Dr. Vineet Thakur from Leiden University today. Vineet will aid us today in understanding the core tenets, the basics of a post-colonial perspective on the one hand, and secondly, he will help us tackle the question of how this post-colonial commitment then bears on practices of knowledge production, such as doing research, producing knowledge, doing research methods. After his presentation, which will go for about 30 minutes, we'll open the floor for a Q&A and debate, and we invite everybody to ask questions then. Vineet completed his PhD at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi in 2014. He worked at universities in India, in South Africa, and the UK before in 2017 joining Leiden University. Vineet's research interests are broadly within the politics of knowledge production from the global south, especially within the discipline of international relations. However, he also, I think more recently, if I got that correctly, has started to become a diplomatic historian with expertise in India and South Africa. And I think his two most recent books cover those two aspects of his work quite well. On the one hand, he published India's First Diplomat, Srinivasa Sastri and the Making of Liberal Internationalism. And on the other hand, the book South Africa, Race and the Making of International Relations. I'm personally very excited to have Vineet here, not just because it gives me the opportunity to connect with him and my university where I did my master's again, but more importantly, as he taught one of the best, if not really the best seminars I had during my time as a student there. So for that reason, I'm really very excited to have him here, and I'm looking forward to his presentation. So as I said, Vineet will talk about 30 minutes about today's topic. Afterwards, we have a Q&A, and I think we'll go as long as 1.5 hours in total, probably for this session. Without further ado, then, Vineet, please, you'll have the floor.
Thanks very much, Wolfgang, and thank you very much for that kind introduction. I think you've set me up for failure now. I'm really pleased and honored that you've asked me to be here to talk about post-colonialism. And I thought what I would do is I don't really have a formal presentation. In fact, what I like to say is the first tenet of post-colonialism is power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts pointlessly. So therefore, I'll not use a PowerPoint, but what I'll do is sort of a bit informally talk about what I think is post-colonialism and what are sort of the key commitments that post-colonialism has. And through that, also try and talk a bit about then questions of how do you do post-colonial work. Now, I work more in history, so I'll probably only be able to sort of tell you a bit more about sort of historical methods when it comes to sort of post-colonial way of doing research. But of course, during the Q&A, we can sort of talk further. But I'm no expert. I mean, I'm all sort of more than my own talk. I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of you how you're doing your research and what are the kind of issues you're facing, and we can talk about it later. All right, post-colonialism, I mean, the first main issue when anyone talks about post-colonialism is the word post itself. And there's been considerable debate in the early 90s, especially there was considerable debate about what is this post. Initially, some people tended to sort of identify post as after, so after colonialism. So it was an analysis of what happens, at the end of colonialism, after colonialism, when colonialism leaves sort of the colonial states in ruins. But increasingly, that perspective was questioned and challenged because post-colonialism or understanding of post-colonialism can not only be got through what happened after colonialism, but also how the colonized societies were shaped during colonialism, and not just during colonialism, but how our understanding of the pre-colonial is also shaped by the colonial. So there were sort of a lot of debate about the term post-colonial, and it's sort of there is a fair degree of agreement now that post doesn't mean after colonialism, but rather how colonialism continues to shape our past, present, and future. So it's about the effects of colonialism rather than after colonialism. And others have therefore de-emphasized another term, decolonial, and there is some degree of difference between post-colonial scholarship and decolonial scholarship. I'm not going to go into details of that now, but we can chat about it in Q&A later. But I also want to say that post-colonialism is also a normative commitment towards emancipation, just like any other critical theory. So therefore, the task is not merely to review the continuities of colonialism, but also work towards decolonizing it in our research, in our own practices of research. Now, in terms of influences, I mean, depending on which discipline you are in, you know, there are multiple sort of origin stories of post-colonialism. So if you are, for instance, in literary studies, probably Edward Said's Orientalism would be the first key post-colonial text. But if, like me, you came from India, I think one of the sort of key texts for Indian post, or not just one of, but sort of a bunch of sort of people who started doing this work, and especially in history, who shaped sort of the whole lot of post-colonial discourse, was this collective called Subaltern Histories Collective, where led by people like Ranajit Guha and Gayatri Spivak and tons of others, where they produced what were called subaltern histories. Another key influence for me in particular was Ashish Nandi, who takes a more of a psychoanalytic sort of, who has a psychoanalytic take on post-colonialism or colonialism, where the emphasis more on what Ngugi wa Thiong'o calls sort of decolonization of the mind. There's also tons of stuff that's influenced by sort of a whole lot of scholarship that emphasizes experientiality. So, for instance, you know, Frans Fanon's Blacks and White Masks was highly influenced by that sort of I mean, he was sort of psychoanalysis, but also sort of experientiality of colonialism. Movements like the Negritude movements or the Coolitude movement or analysis of Creole thinking and all of that, they are to a significant degree shaped by the sense of experientiality. So anyways, the point I'm trying to say is that there are multiple origins if one were to sort of try and find sort of the genealogy of the post-colonial. But if I had to put post-colonialism in a de-jargonized way, I'd say that it is primarily about how the world looks from the perspective of the colonized. So if the subject of the history of our histories is not the West, in fact, primarily it's been the cis white European male who's written history, and it's that perspective which is assumed to be the universal perspective of history. If that is not our primary reference, if our primary reference of history is the colonized, and how do the colonized write their own histories? What does the world look like from the perspective of the colonized? And that's essentially what sort of post-colonialism is trying to do. And now, doing that requires, and in doing that, post-colonialism sort of makes three kinds of claims, which are connected claims. But these claims also have to be understood, I think, all in relation to each other. The first claim is about, and it's a term that's been popularized by Dipesh Chakrabarty's book, and the claim is about provincializing Europe, and it's a phrase that you might have heard. Where the understanding is that, you know, our knowledge practices, our knowledge, which is assumed to be universal and objective, is basically European knowledge. Europe is always the norm, and consequently, every other perspective is deemed provincial. So what we call universal is basically Western or European. And the need and effort, therefore, is in any post-colonial research is to cut Europe to its size. Is to provincialize Europe or de-universalize Europe in that way. But de-universalizing or provincializing Europe does not mean that knowledge from a certain geographical space or cultural milieu is only applicable or restricted to that space. It doesn't mean that European knowledge should only apply to Europe. No. What it means is that we need to be attentive one to connected histories, but also entanglement of histories, how European knowledge tends to take sort of hegemonic form when it travels elsewhere because of whole histories of colonialism. So we need to be sort of attentive to this element of hegemony that comes with Western forms of knowledge because of the very specific ways in which your colonialism has shaped our practices of knowledge construction, reception, and consumption. So that's sort of the first point I'd make about sort of provincializing Europe, that it's not about reducing Europe just to Europe, but about sort of understanding European knowledge in light of its hegemony. Second, and it's a claim a lot of post-colonial scholars have made, but I think it's sort of that this claim is sort of condensed very well in that statement by Frantz Fanon, where Fanon said Europe is literally the construction of the third world, where the idea is that what we consider Europe is also not sort of constituted from just within Europe. Europe was shaped in active sort of entanglement with the rest of the world. The third world contributed to sort of the making of Europe. You know, these beautiful European cities and wonderful architecture, infrastructure that we see. Where does all this wealth come from? There is a connected history of slavery and colonialism and imperialism and all of that. So Europe, or the universality of Europe, has always been sort of created in entanglement with the third world. So how, for instance, European ideas of liberty, equality, and fraternity, they have also been shaped by the colonial encounter. So for instance, Gerald Horne has this wonderful book where he argues how that, American Revolution was deeply informed by anxieties of white settlers about the abolition of slavery, because they thought that Britain is soon going to abolish slavery. And that was one of the key motivations for the American Revolution. I was just reading today that, the Mayflower, that the ship that which dropped the Pilgrims, went on further to West Indies and was to carry the cargo, which was the slaves. So it was the same ship that was delivering pilgrims to America, but also delivering slaves. So these are kind of connected histories, and the whole point of here being that European Enlightenment is as much a product of slavery and colonialism as much as it is of great ideas. So the first big claim that, or the first assertion that post-colonial scholarship makes is about provincializing Europe. The second, and then, like I said, it's sort of a connected claim, is about recovery, which is that it's not enough to reveal the problems with European thought. And frankly, that's something that post-colonial scholarship did for the longest time. A lot of post-colonial scholarship, especially in the discipline that I come from, international relations, was about lamenting. It was a constant lament about, Europe has done this, Europe is responsible for everything and all of that. But post-colonial scholarship also, in a way, commits to going beyond the sense of lament and recovering what is assumed to be the silenced or erased histories of the global South or the third world, whichever term you prefer. The lament that I was talking about, I think it happened primarily or in many ways or significantly because I think a lot of early post-colonial scholarship, especially in literary studies and history and all that, was based in America or in the West, and they were primarily having a conversation with Western scholarship. But in the past 20 years or so, and I'm speaking from my own discipline, I think there is more focus on recovery of knowledge within the global South or from the global South that's been either erased, lost, or silenced. So there's a lot of focus on now alternative conceptions or ideas that come from the global South. And in order to sort of come up with these alternative conceptions, alternative histories, alternative epistemologies, alternative ideas, a key sort of way of doing it is what is often called sort of reading against the grain. You need to find these alternative ideas and histories, and how do you find them? And that process of recovery faces significant challenges, and in turn then requires significant investment from scholars of the Global South. So what are those kinds of challenges? There's this great book by Michel Rolls-Trullo. It's actually here. It's called Silencing the Past. I'm sure you're reading. I don't know if you can read it. And in this book, Trullo argues that there are 4 ways or 4 stages of silencing of any historical discourse. And the 4 stages are what he calls the moments facts are created, that is the making of sources, the moments facts are assembled, which he calls sort of making of archives, the moments facts are retrieved, which is the making of narratives, and the moments or when facts become retrospectively significant, that is the making of history. And let me sort of quickly clarify what all of these 4 are. So the first sort of stage, or the first way in which alternative histories are silenced are what he calls at the source, at the making of the sources, which is when history is happening, or what we consider history, when an event is happening, we need to ask questions about who gets to write, who is writing that history at that point in time. So in most cases, for instance, it will, if it is white men, for instance, who are writing a history of a particular moment, if they're writing a history of Haitian Revolution, for instance, and it's being written by a French white man, it will be written from a certain perspective. So at the very moment in which the event is happening, the history is being created, at that very moment, the way facts are assembled shapes in which history is told, and therefore also shapes in which the silences emerge. One way of thinking about it is, again, Trullo talks about 2 different ways in which narratives are formed. One is what he calls sort of commentary. Second is narration. So commentary is, just imagine you're watching a normal, whatever, football match, and the commentator is sort of commenting on something. It's something that's sort of unfolding in real time. And the commentator is actually not necessarily deliberately sort of trying to silence someone. They're basically trying to narrate what they see on the ground. But even then, while they're trying to narrate what's happening on ground, they're telling a particular version of a story, right? They're telling they're probably focusing more on the players rather than, say, the audience. And there are tons of things which may be happening in that particular ground, but the commentator is choosing to sort of narrate only a specific part of that story. Now, it doesn't mean that the commentator is ideologically motivated. It's just that the commentator also is following certain rules of the game, and they are sort of narrating a story from the perspective of those rules of the game. But there are tons of things even in that narration which are being sidelined. Like I said, it may be that the audience, they're so loud that they are not able to sort of, that somehow they're sort of shaping the way the players are playing on ground, but the commentator may not be able to comment on that. Now, this is sort of a very random abstract example, but a very concrete example in history writing is, for instance, how during slavery, planters or overseers, they, when they maintained their sort of records, they would not record, black babies who were newborn black babies, because the infant mortality rate was so high that these black babies were more likely to die than live. So they just chose not to write about them, and therefore the whole if you and I were to go and read those archives now, we will not know how many black babies were born, because they were never even recorded. So, and it's not that the planters or the overseers are deliberately trying to sort of they are ideologically motivated. It's just that they are performing the rules of the game, where they feel that it's not useful to to chronicle or to sort of note these numbers down. So it's not deliberate or evil. It's just that it's just the logic of accounting. So at that very moment, at the moment in which facts are created, there are certain silences that go into into narratives, and that's sort of the first form of silencing. The second form, or the second stage of silencing, what Trullo argues, is the moment when these facts are assembled, which is what he calls the making of the archives. So we have the sort of sources, people have sort of written these archives and all of that, but where are these archives placed? If there is a national archives, who determines that a particular archive goes to a national archive or a local archive or is not even archived? So the story that is archived and the stories that are not archived, there's a politics of determining that, which sources go into archives and which sources don't go into archives. Which sources go into which archives, that's a sort of a political story as well. How are they cataloged? Think about our libraries, for instance. Let's imagine you're interested in exploring history of Afghanistan. Are you likely to find it under a section on South Asia or Central Asia or world history? I mean, it could go anywhere, but there's certain politics behind it which will put it in a certain place. For instance, if you ever go into a section on civil wars in our libraries, I'm pretty sure you'll never find a book on the sort of the probably the most horrific civil war in world history, which was Taipei Rebellion, where about 20 to 30 million people were killed. But you're not likely to find that in a section on civil wars. You'll find that in a section on China. So so at the stage in which at the making of archives, a knowledge is shaped by how it is cataloged, where it is placed, and so on. And in the book, Trullo talks about how archives assemble, but this is not a passive act of collecting, but rather an active act of production that prepares facts for historical intelligibility. So if you and I are working on civil wars and we choose our books from that, that area of the library where books on civil war are on, we're never likely to sort of see a book on Taipei Rebellion, and we will never consider that as part of our data of civil wars. The understanding there is that as historians, we're never alone. The encounter with the document is the encounter with the guild. So why a particular document is placed in a certain place or area or archives is determined or shaped by the rules of the guild, which is the historical profession. And those rules of the guild, those sort of rules are kind of always political. They ensure forms of erasure. The third stage at which silencing happens is the stage of making of narratives. And this is sort of relatively straightforward. How are certain facts narrated? What becomes crucial to narrate, so for instance, I gave you examples of Taipei Rebellion. The fact that I chose Taipei Rebellion and not any other rebellion, I've presented you certain facts, but hidden other facts from you. And that happens in any kind of narration. So who's narrating and what is the politics of the narrator becomes very crucial. What story do they want to tell? That is very important. And some stories are recalled with more than others, with much richer detail, much empirical richness than others. And in this stage, the role of the historian becomes important. And because most of the historians are, like I said, cis white males, history there is told from a particular perspective. And fourth, moment of erasure is the moment when facts become retrospectively significant. Facts, whatever. Columbus went to America in 1492. That is a fact, but how it becomes significant is how that fact relates to the story that we're trying to tell from the perspective of the present. Every past has a theory of future. And therefore, every fact becomes significant, in fact, retrospectively. What facts become significant and what facts are not significant are, in a way, shaped by, our perspective in the present. And if you combine all of these sort of four forms of erasure, from the making of the archive or from the writing of the archive to eventually how, these archival stories are told, you'll sort of understand how, sort of stories of the non-West become or erased or lost or silenced from these in each of these stages. And therefore, consequently, writing a history from the global South is not just about changing the narrative, but it's also about, sort of trying to sort of find out ways through which to sort of encounter, sort of work your way through all these kinds of erasures. Okay, then. So we've talked about sort of the, forms of erasure and all of that. Now, thinking about writing through these silences, or deliberate or otherwise, like I've said, how do you then narrate from the perspective of the colonized? What do you do in order to sort of work through these silences? One needs to find either alternative archives or alternative ways of reading these archives. And there are plenty of ways in which people have tried to do it. One way is, of course, working through, okay, let's go to sort of first form of erasure, fact of narration. If you are interested in a post-colonial perspective, you could sort of, what is often called, contrapuntal reading. You can read a particular event against the grain, which is that, you can read through, you read what's been written, but then read through the silences by reading through other accounts of the same period and sort of triangulating, oral, written, and all kinds of data that you can, and try and figure out a way in which you try to tell the story of silences. So contrapuntal reading, which is slightly different from contextual reading, sort of Cambridge School contextual reading kind of stuff. It's about reading through silences and erasures. And that's one way of doing it. The second way of doing it is trying to find archives where you are more likely to find presence of, the global South or the oppressed and so on and so forth. So, for instance, if you're interested in, history during slavery, you're more likely to find slave accounts in court records or jailhouses. So that's where you have to go, and not really, accounts of the state, for instance, or ego documents of travelers and all of that. That's not where you're going to find sort of narrations of the oppressed. But also one needs to understand that, writing itself has been sort of colonially imposed in several societies, where there was never a hierarchy between written forms of knowledge and oral forms of knowledge. In several societies, oral knowledge, because it's sort of more easily transferable and has its own theory, was considered much more important than written sources, and therefore, in those cases, you might have to go to sort of oral archives. And memory, for instance, is an important archival source, how people remember certain histories. And that, when you get into sort of questions of memory and all that, you invariably get into questions of what is the importance of history? Why do we need to know, for instance, what is important? Is it important to know a particular date in which whatever Columbus went to America, or is it more important to know what happened and how is that event remembered? So I think it then opens a whole lot of questions about the value of history, what we consider to be truth, and why history needs to be told. Beyond looking at archives, then I think there's an important question of forms of narration. If you're going to write histories of lay people, histories of the oppressed, what is the form of narration you're going to take? Can you write them in normal forms of academic articles? Because in order to write proper academic articles, you need to sort of find written sources of archives. You need to sort of go through the rituals of the guild. But since you do not have sources which really sort of comply with the rituals of the guild, you have to find alternative ways of narrating those stories. So therefore, several scholars prefer poetry instead of prose, because poetry allows you to sort of tell ideas in a far more imaginative manner than prose. There's also sort of the attendant question of the language. If one and there's been a long debate about, can you really write in the language of the colonizer? and sort of there's this sort of great debate that happened between two of the greatest African authors, Chinua Achebe and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, where I don't know if you know that Ngugi wa Thiong'o stopped writing in English after his first couple of novels and wrote entirely in Gikuyu. And then later in life, he started translating his Gikuyu novels and Gikuyu writing into English. And Ngugi wa Thiong'o's, what he said was that we cannot write in the language of the colonizer. One, because it does not allow you enough imaginative possibilities. But second, it means that our own local knowledges are being killed. And, you know, Gikuyu as a language itself is being killed. And how do you sort of convey sort of the traditional knowledge of a people, which is sort of coded in a particular language? How do you translate into in a language which is basically the colonizer's language? And therefore, it was important for him to, in order to decolonize, it was important to decolonize the mind. And in order to decolonize the mind, you need to tell your own stories in your own language, because that's where also you're going to be more likely to find the archive of your stories. And the opposite perspective was of Chinua Achebe, who wrote primarily in English. And Achebe argued that English is very much a Nigerian language. He argued that through, you know, it's not sort of fair to say that, you know, English is entirely a colonizer language, because the Nigerians adapted it and sort of have used it against the colonizer. Independence would not have been possible without the use of this very language by the colonized. So therefore, there was a need to sort of own up to this sort of very Nigerian form of English and tell our stories in that language. You don't fight with your tools. That's what Achebe would argue, because English itself has become a very Nigerian language. And that, in a way, is also, to me, I think, sort of the core debate between what are called post-colonial and decolonial perspectives, where in post-colonial perspectives, you will see terms such as hybridity, bastardization used a lot, where the preference is for looking at the continuities of colonialism, but also looking at how colonial ideas may have shaped post-colonial reality, but how that post-colonial sort of bastardized post-colonial reality is also a constant form of resistance against the colonized. Whereas decolonial perspectives are about complete epistemic sort of break. They are about completely breaking away from colonial forms of knowledge and articulating a completely alternative forms of knowledge. And that is sort of the core distinction between post-colonial and decolonial. Okay, last point, and I'll finish with that. And that's, to me, is also an important concern of post-colonial scholarship, and it's a recent concern of post-colonial scholarship, because it's emerged from critiques that of post-colonial scholarship, sort of, I'd call them internal critiques of post-colonial scholarship, from sort of indigenous critiques and for instance past questions and so on and so forth, where the post-colonial itself also tends to be hegemonic in the post-colony, because post-colonial scholars, one, they themselves are elite, but they're also telling sort of certain elitist histories of their own places, where there are subalterns within the subaltern, and in telling those stories, those stories are also oppressive to those who are further sort of oppressed in those societies. And in case of India, caste sort of an important sort of category, for instance, where most of India's post-colonial scholarship comes from what are called Bhadralok scholars, Bengali, middle class, upper caste elite, but not just Bengali, but mostly post-colonial scholarship comes from upper caste Indian elite, and they tend to be completely dismissive of the problems with post-colonial scholarship, how it sort of perpetuates a certain casteist agenda. And similarly, there have been debates about, critiques from First Nations and indigenous peoples about sort of this hegemonizing the agenda of post-colonial. So therefore, the third sort of important sort of point or concern that post-colonial scholarship has now sort of started taking far more seriously, and it goes back to the point that I was saying initially about sort of the normative agenda of post-colonialism, which is about emancipation. And that point is about the internal hegemony of the post-colonial critique itself, how it is also very hegemonic towards those who are subaltern within it. Anyways, in the end, I want to finish with sort of this small excerpt from Linda Tuahai-Smith in her book, Decolonizing Methodologies, where I thought, which allows us to think more about research itself as an idea and our research practices, and how we should be eminently attentive to the historical ways in which research itself has been advisor to colonialism. Tuahai-Smith says, from the vantage point of the colonized, a position from which I write and choose to privilege, the term research is inextricably linked to European imperialism and colonialism. The word itself, research, is probably one of the dirtiest words in the indigenous world's vocabulary. When mentioned in many indigenous contexts, it stirs up silence, it conjures up bad memories, it raises a smile that is knowing and distrustful. It is so powerful that indigenous people even write poetry about research. The ways in which scientific research is implicated in the worst excesses of colonialism remains a powerful remembered history for many of the world's colonized peoples. It is a history that still offends the deepest sense of our humanity. Just knowing that someone measured our faculties by filling the skulls of our ancestors with millet seeds and compared the amount of millet seed to the capacity for mental thought offends a sense of who and what we are. It galls us that Western researchers and intellectuals can assume to know that it is possible to know of us on the basis of their brief encounters with some of us. It appalls us that the West can desire, extract, and claim ownership in our ways of knowing, our imagery, the things we create and produce, and then simultaneously reject the people who created and developed those ideas and seek to deny them further opportunities to be creators of their own culture and own nations. It angers us when practices linked to the last century and the centuries before that are still employed to deny the validity of indigenous people's claims to existence, to land and to territories, to the right to self-determination, to the survival of our languages and forms of cultural knowledge, to our natural resources and systems of living within our environments. I think that's a good thought to end on. Thank you.